video, we're going to talk about the legislatures of Mexico and Nigeria, which are bicameral legislatures. So that is defined as a legislature that has two houses. And 4 of the 6 countries in the AP6 technically have bicameral legislatures. So the UK, the Russian Federation, Nigeria, and Mexico each have 2 different houses of their legislature. And it's interesting to note that statistically speaking, bicameral legislatures are actually a slight minority. So 41% of the world's countries have bicameral legislatures, or divide their legislature up into 2 separate houses. So it's kind of interesting for us as Americans to think about, not everybody has their government structured the same way that we do, and it's sort of interesting to look at some of the reasons for the structuring of bicameral versus unitary legislatures. So countries that are bicameral are also more likely to be federal. And this probably is not a coincidence. A lot of the same things that make countries want to structure their legislatures in a way that's bicameral also make them want to distribute powers at different levels of government, right? They might be geographically larger. They might be more geared toward trying to give specific representation, kind of geographically speaking. So many countries also have distinct separate purposes for the upper and lower house of their legislature, right? So thinking about an example of this would be Russia. So Russia essentially has one house that is the Duma, which is the lower house, and they are really the vessel for lawmaking within the country, kind of constitutionally. And the upper house, called the Federation Council, is used more for geographic purposes, to serve as geographic representation, to solve kind of disputes that are rooted in the federal structure of government, if that makes sense. And they're called the Federation Council. And a weaker version of this would be the United States, where you have slightly different purposes of the Senate and the House of Representatives, right? The House is meant to handle more budgetary matters, and to pass budgets, and to do a lot of other things. Not going to get into U.S. kind of reserved powers for the different houses. And the Senate does more things like confirm appointees from the executive branch and things like that. So each sort of house has separate delegated powers. And they might also have different electoral systems, which we will get into as well. So sorry for the formatting on this. So within bicameralism, we have 2 terms that we use that are often kind of weird. So you'll hear us use the term upper house and lower house. And I wanted to actually define those because they're kind of tricky and kind of weird. But upper houses actually tend to be smaller and less powerful in bicameral legislatures. Not always. The U.S. is actually a pretty good example of that not always being the case, because both houses of our legislature have significant kind of powers. But the upper house is often, numbers-wise, a lot smaller, and the powers are often more restricted. So an instance, a kind of extreme example of this, not necessarily the numbers-wise, but the powers being more restricted, would be the House of Lords, which essentially doesn't do much of anything from a policy-making perspective, although is extremely large. So I don't know. Other countries use the upper house, for regional representation or geographic purposes, or for like a different purpose altogether. So the Federation Council, because Russia is so geographically distinct and involves so many different types of political kind of organizations at the subnational level, oftentimes the Federation Council will be involved in doing many of kind of the settling of disputes or things like that. So for the 4 countries that we study, the Senate in Mexico and Nigeria are the upper house, the House of Lords, and then the Federation Council is the upper house for Russia. And the lower house is where we tend to see more direct representation of the people in the country. So generally speaking, often has more power than the upper house. So that's a little bit of an inversion, you might think, given the upper-lower dynamic of the words. But the lower house often has more power because it's more directly representing the people. So the best example of this would be the House of Commons within the UK, which is directly elected, whereas the House of Lords is not directly elected. And the Chamber of Deputies and the Duma as well are more directly elected than the upper house, right? And thinking about the original purpose of the Senate in the U.S., the original purpose was that the Senate wasn't directly elected, that it was appointed by state legislatures. That changed with a constitutional amendment in the early 20th century, but kind of that idea that the upper house has a different purpose and a different structure than the lower house, which is sometimes a little bit conflated now. But oftentimes the lower house will be the source of laws that are passed in the country, right? So the lower house is more likely to have lawmaking powers. So the U.S. is actually pretty weird in its structure in that the Senate and the House both have significant lawmaking powers, which the effect of that can be that it is actually really hard to pass laws because they have to pass separately, kind of both the House and the Senate, and then become reconciled between the two. So it's sort of a process of reconciliation that happens between the two houses, and then they have to go through the president kind of and their veto power. So countries that kind of delegate lawmaking powers. Now, one of their two houses actually that can be a little bit of a guard against kind of the gridlock effect that we see in the United States, where you sort of have to thread the needle between passing laws in two separate houses. But enough about the U.S. Getting into the countries we actually study, Mexico's legislature. So thinking about Mexico, so a lot of what I'm going to say about Mexico and Nigeria in terms of their legislative structure are things that you would actually assume to be true, given kind of what we've talked about in the introduction to these countries. So Mexico's legislature was pretty limited during the dominant rule of the PRI during the 20th century, and today is sort of getting its sea legs from kind of this period of authoritarianism that exists. So it is the legislative branch is much weaker than the executive branch. The executive branch, due to some of the things we talked about in the video yesterday, the fact that the president can rule by decree, the fact that the president can directly introduce things into the Chamber of Deputies, is actually pretty, like, I don't want to say subservient is not necessarily the right term, because they're not quite a rubber stamp legislature like they were in the 20th century, but has significantly weakened powers kind of compared to Congress in the United States. So the duty of the Chamber of Deputies, which is the lower house in Mexico, is to pass laws, levy taxes, and verify elections. So for both Nigeria and Mexico, their lower houses are going to look a whole lot like the House of Representatives in the US. And that's not coincidental, given that they were modeled after the House of Representatives. The Chamber of Deputies has 500 members and is directly elected. So they used to have, kind of harkening back to Mexico's love of term limits, they used to have kind of the only 1 3-year term. So this was another way in which the power of the legislature was pretty severely impacted. You can only serve for 3 years. That prevents anyone from gaining too much power, or really any sort of institutional knowledge from developing. So Mexico changed this in 2015, and now they have a limit of 2 consecutive term limits. And but still only 6 years, and that's not a long time in kind of the legislative world. Thinking about all the senators, House members that have been in our Congress for 40 or 50 years. So, and one thing that we're going to go pretty light on right now, but I'll talk a lot about later, is the electoral system. So for the Chamber of Deputies, they elect 300 of their members, of their 500 members, through single member district, just sort of straight up voting, first past the post. You have different candidates in different districts. The person with the most votes wins. And then they delegate 200 of their seats in the Chamber of Deputies based on the proportion that each political party gets in the national vote. So we will talk a lot about the difference between first past the post and proportional representation in a separate video. All right, going on to the Senate. So again, looking a lot like the U.S. Senate. Not surprising, not a coincidence. They have 128 members, directly elected to 6-year terms. That sounds like the U.S. 2 consecutive terms allowed. So again, you have 2 term limits, but loosened term limits kind of compared to where they were. And their electoral system is they have 2 senators for each state, and then let's see. Yeah, two kind of senators for the next highest state, and then kind of one, and then they have a kind of system of proportional representation under that. So we'll talk about that later. All right, moving on to Nigeria. Let's see. Too long. Moving on to Nigeria. So like we said before, Nigeria was a parliamentary system until 1979. So they had a system of government that's going to closely resemble what we're going to talk about when we talk about the UK. But now they are have a bicameral legislature, which in many ways is structured after the United States. So it's going to look a lot like the US. So one kind of the length of the terms is an interesting difference. So senators and representatives serve 4-year terms, elected the week before the president. So that's kind of a neat setup. I wonder, I don't actually have a good reason for an explanation for that. I'm wondering if because of some of the difficulty of running elections in Nigeria, it might make sense to have kind of one big election period in which you can sort of do both of them at the same time. But that's a little bit of a hypothesis. All right, so Nigeria's Senate, since they have 36 states, they have 109 senators, so 3 per each state, and then 1 from the capital, which is Abuja. And they are all elected directly, first past the post, whoever gets the most wins. And because of Nigeria's diversity, the Senate itself is very diverse as well. All right, and now we'll go to the lower house of Nigeria, which is the House of Representatives. So they have 360 members. All of them voted in by first past the post. So Nigeria is divided up into 360 different congressional districts. Whoever gets the most votes in each congressional district wins. And some interesting things about kind of the House of Representatives in Nigeria, they have one of the lower rates of female representation in terms of legislature across the world. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about Mexico and their systems of having a gender-based quota for their legislature. Nigeria, on the other hand, has very, very low rate of female representation. And the last one, again, as you would think, very little power. One sort of brief moment of, I don't know if it's glory, but probably depending on who you ask within Nigeria. But one sort of thing that's noteworthy that they did was they acted as a check on the president, and they didn't allow the first president, Olusegun Obasanjo, who was elected in 1999 and was done in 2007 and wanted to have a third term. They didn't give him the go-ahead for that. So that is a shining moment of the legislative branch standing up to the executive branch. But many of the same things we said for Mexico, very weak, kind of given the structure of government and the strong tradition of executive power within the country. All right, thanks.